Okay. Thank you so much, Brendan. And I'm very, very excited to be here. I have published in QE in 2020 and 2021, I believe. And I'm very excited all the time to be, talking about ways in which we can make qualitative and quantitative research, data analysis talk together. So I'm super excited to talk to you more about the intersection of that along with the issues of bias, the topic that I'll be talking about today. I'm really looking forward to our Q&A to talk more about it, specifically in the context of QE, but my talk right now is designed to be a little more broad, hopefully also touches upon the different aspects of learning analytics and learning sciences as well that you all may be interested in. All right, without much further ado, I'm gonna start my talk. Today I'm going to be presenting one of my dissertation studies on bias in upstream sources that shape real-time adaptation in learning systems. Investigating bias in automated decisions especially has become increasingly important in education because of the harms caused by bias systems to specific students or populations. So in the presentation today, I will discuss why it is important to investigate upstream sources for potential biases and empirically also illustrate some demographic disparities in one such source. So let me begin by quickly sharing my path to this work. I came to this work as a computer scientist with expertise in machine learning and fascinated about building models to accurately predict student needs in real time. As such, I started building predictive models of complex educational constructs such as affect, persistence, motivation, and math success. The idea in a nutshell is to learn patterns in large amounts of past data on a construct, such that a new data sample can be automatically labeled by the model in real time. Like in one of my past work with Dr. Nai, I used machine learning model to detect students' emotion using their facial expression data. I'm sure this is not new to the audience of this webinar. The idea basically in a nutshell is to create predictive models using past data. But at the same time, as a doctoral student in learning sciences, around this time I was introduced to the inextricable link between learning and context, which made me question the role of context in model development from student data. Particularly, I was interested in investigating how ignoring learner context in the design and development of adaptive learning systems could introduce harmful biases in them. Let me illustrate this with an example of detecting students' emotion using facial expression data. Ignoring gender and racial context of students in this example is likely to introduce biases against female students of color due to poor performance of facial recognition on females with darker skin tones. This is also true for other forms of data. There have been reports of encoding bias against certain linguistic and ethnic groups in automated essay scoring and also in marking African American English as toxic by hate speech detectors. Now I'll present arguments for why bias is a serious problem for the learning systems that I have been studying. I study contextual factors to understand bias, specifically in adaptive and artificially intelligent learning systems. The general goal of these systems is to optimize student learning with one-to-one instruction and immediate feedback, which is often hard to achieve in traditional schooling. These systems attempt to identify key moments in students' learning to adapt based on perceived student needs. Such automated decision-making often involves little to no human intervention. Adaptive learning systems are being increasingly adopted in education, including formal public education. Several forms of adaptive systems exist today, from fully online to blended learning environments, from learning games to open-ended learning systems, and from sketching-based to dialogue-based tutors. and they have been designed for diverse subject matters and built on several platforms, including virtual reality and wearable technology. As I say that, I recognize that all this is probably not new to most of the audience of this webinar, but just wanted to give you a quick overview of the kinds of systems that I have been particularly focusing on, which are adaptive learning systems. Studying bias is in these adaptive learning systems is important because they make real-time decisions that impact students' learning and experiences closely. But it is particularly challenging task as these systems often involve models of complex educational constructs, such as behavior, affect, and motivation. And it also utilizes rich student data, such as fine-grained student interaction data. These complexities may likely introduce complex biases, which need a more nuanced approach to identify and mitigate. Also, despite the wide usage of the systems, biases in these systems have not yet been studied thoroughly. Let me give a quick example. LearnTA, which is an intelligent tutoring system or an adaptive learning system, uses an algorithmic model of student knowledge to predict a student's current skill level and decide the difficulty level of the content they will see next. If the knowledge estimation model in here were to be biased against female students, it may systematically deliver content below the student's skill level, leading to missed learning opportunities or a suboptimal experience, potentially lowering achievement and engagement in female students in the long run. Moreover, this could also become a self-fulfilling prophecy, wherein the incorrect prediction for female students may lead to actual low performance, further confirming the student's bias, the system's bias, and thus perpetuating the system's behavior. In this fashion, adaptive systems have the potential to obscure the root cause of bias and automate its effect, making it harder to objectively identify and fix it. In addition, these systems often serve a diverse student population, with a single system catering to students from different grade levels, countries, and socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds. This further complicates the issue of bias, as now the system behavior needs to be non-discriminatory across all the students' populations that it's serving. Therefore, as these systems continue to be used by diverse student populations across the United States and the globe, they need to ensure that their pedagogical decisions meet the needs of all students for an equitable outcome. Next, I'll present arguments for why we need to look beyond just algorithms to identify and mitigate bias in upstream sources that shape adaptive learning systems. Let's take the running example of affect detection, and let's unpack the detector development process. In a standard machine learning workflow, we start by collecting sample S from a probability distribution P. For instance, pairs of images and annotated affective states. Then we choose a model class H, let's say a set of neural networks. We then find a model in this model class which has the lowest prediction error on sample S. Lastly, and this is particularly important for our discussion, we estimate the true error of this model for any future data by testing it on new data that is also drawn from P. This methodology is justified by the fundamental theorem of machine learning on generalization. In simple terms, no matter how complicated the distribution is, for a reasonable model class, if we have enough data, then for any model, the error on current data is a close approximation of the error in the real world. Simply put, if a model does well on the data in hand, it is expected to do well on any unseen data in the future. While this approach may work well for predicting, say, Pittsburgh's weather tomorrow, it falls short in serving diverse student populations, especially those who were under or underrepresented in the sample S. As reported by Paquette and colleagues in their recent review of papers from educational data mining, student population information is often not reported with generalization estimates, making it especially hard to contextualize models. It reminds me of the quote by George Box: "All models are wrong, but some are useful." The question that is often ignored is useful for who? Are the models disproportionately useful for some student subpopulations over others? Well, by design, most machine learning models are optimized for the majority population because of its focus on reducing the overall error. This leads to bias towards those who do not look like the majority population. There are several reasons for why this may happen. The data collected may be less accurate for some groups. For example, earlier cameras were designed to bring out high contrast and better resolution for white skin color. Or the construct of interest may look different in different subgroups. For example, cultural differences in the expressions of emotion. Or some subgroups may just be hard to predict. For example, students wearing niqab. Identifying this serious issue, several recent research projects have examined bias in algorithmic systems in education. However, the focus has mostly been on investigating bias in predictive modeling, particularly its downstream stages like model development and evaluation. While this is an important step in the right direction, I argue that the issue of bias arises well before the actual model development, and that the current emphasis on downstream stages will limit the progress towards equity in adaptive learning systems if we don't broaden our search. By considering 3 upstream components separately, my dissertation aimed to bring to attention those aspects that closely shape adaptive decision making, but are often obscured in the evaluation of bias in an algorithmic model. Data collection methods and system design directly impact modeling efforts. Moreover, theories impact system design, data collection, and the algorithmic design. Letting an algorithmic model perpetuate an upstream bias in its discriminatory decision making may further harm the sensitive groups, leading to outcomes that falsely confirm the upstream bias. Studying upstream bias is important not only because it could form a basis for bias in an algorithmic model, but also because it could lead to direct discriminatory behaviors in an adaptive system. For example, an affective intervention based on a biased theory. By empirically analyzing student data previously collected from various virtual learning systems, I investigated demographic disparities in 3 representative cases of upstream bias. Varying effectiveness of methodological improvements in annotated data collection, differing implications of technology design on student outcomes, and varying rates of data conformance to a theoretical model. I'm now going to present study 3 from my dissertation. In this study, I empirically illustrated demographic disparity in the non-conformance of data to a widely accepted theoretical model used to design adaptivity in learning systems. Before I begin, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all who made this study possible. I chose to study theory as an upstream source because it closely influences several aspects of adaptive decisions, including the conceptualization of a construct, the interpretation of student behaviors, the construction of variables in modeling, and the design of interventions in adaptive systems. In this study, I specifically look at an affective theory. Affect has been theorized to play 3 primary roles in learning by drawing attention to learning challenges, appraising learning, and guiding cognitive focus. Accordingly, empirical studies in adaptive and artificially intelligent systems show strong correlations between affect and a range of important educational constructs, such as self-efficacy, analytical reasoning, learning, and motivation. Identifying the inextricable link between affect and learning, affective computing in education attempts to recognize, measure, analyze, and respond to student affect to narrow the communicative gap between the highly emotional human and the emotionally challenged computer. Accordingly, studies in the past decade have built automated affect detectors for adaptive learning systems using physical and physiological sensors and interaction log data. These detectors have been used to design affect-sensitive interventions in these adaptive systems. Let's consider this example of an affect-aware tutor. Considerable research has investigated the development of what's called affect-sensitive or affect-aware learning systems, wherein student experience is personalized based on the system's ability to detect and respond to students' affective states. The foundational hypothesis of this research is that detecting and responding to student affect improves the quality of students' interaction with the system by making it more engaging and effective for learning. Recognizing the limited utility in mere affect recognition, significant effort has been put into understanding how these states evolve and interact in effortful learning activities, an area of research called affect dynamics. The popular theoretical model of affect dynamics was proposed by De Mello and Gresa in 2012. Using theories of cognitive disequilibrium, they postulate that a specific set of affect transitions will be particularly prominent. The model predicts that students who experience an impasse during the flow state will transition to a state of disequilibrium, which manifests itself as the affective state of confusion. If the student resolves this impasse, they are predicted to transition back to flow. If, however, the impasse is not resolved, students are hypothesized to become stuck, which is experienced as frustration. If the frustration persists, the model suggests the learner will disengage and transition to boredom. I chose to investigate potential biases in this model because it's a highly cited and widely accepted model in the field, which has been used in diverse study contexts to design adaptive affective interventions, including some of my own earlier works in this area. To understand the applicability of the model, I first conducted a systematic review to investigate the impact of the methodological and contextual differences in past empirical studies, particularly with respect to their conformance to the theoretical model. My results suggest that the studies that show some evidence for the model were all collected in the United States with undergraduate populations. They were also done in lab settings using learning systems that were primarily built for research and followed a linear design. They also involved shorter learning activity and collected student self-reports of affect retrospectively at the completion of the activity. Another important methodological difference is the inconsistent treatment of self-transitions. Let me take a couple of minutes to quickly explain the implications of this choice on the validity of the results. Also, a way in which statistical bias, which is different from the bias of this, the bias that I've been talking about, which is a societal bias to an extent, there's a difference here, and this being a statistical bias. I wanted to quickly explain how this led to a statistical bias in the results and thus to the conformance of the model. The typical data used in this research is temporally sequenced codes representing student affect. So at each interval of time, an affect observation is collected either by human annotation or automated affect detection or student self-reports. Studies that did conform to the theoretical model used the sequence as is. In contrast, the studies that did show some evidence towards removed these self-transitions as part of their data preprocessing step by excluding the instances when a student remained in the same affective states over 2 or more consecutive observations. The seemingly small step of excluding self-transitions leads to the violation of independence assumption in the statistic used, since the next state now can only take values other than the previous state. Let me quickly illustrate this with an example. Given an affect sequence, the L statistic calculates the likelihood that an affective state will transition to a subsequent state, given the base rate of the state occurring, and the chance value of L here is 0. Consider now an affective sequence with 3 states, A, B, and C, in which all transitions are equally likely. To compute the likelihood of a transition A to B, we first compute the base rate of B, which is 0.33 here, as there are 3 states. Next, we compute the conditional probability of B as the next state given A as the previous state. Since A can transition to A, B, or C, the conditional probability is also 0.33. And now when we plug this into the equation of L, we get L equals 0, which is what we would expect since all transitions are equally likely. This is true for all 9 possible transitions with 3 states. Now, when we remove the self-transitions, the base rate of B remains unchanged as we still have 3 states. However, since A now can only transition into B or C and not to itself because we removed self-transitions, the conditional probability of B as the next state given A as the previous state becomes 0.5. And now when we plug this into the equation of L, we see that the chance value of L has shifted from 0 to a positive value. This is true for all the 6 possible transitions with 3 states when self-transitions are excluded. This issue is evident in a 2018 study that similarly excluded self-transitions and reported a mathematically impossible result, wherein all transitions into the affective state of engaged concentration were more likely than chance. In one of my previous papers, I presented a mathematical proof for this issue and provided a simple fix which shifted the chance value of L from 0 to a positive value based on the number of affective states. Although this treatment fixed the problem, it could still lead to misinterpretation of the results due to the counterintuitive non-zero chance value. So motivated by this issue, my mathematician friend, Dr. Jeff Matayushi, and I developed a modified version of the L statistic, which we refer to as L star, which shifts the chance value back to 0 when self-transitions are removed. More importantly, this finding implies that the past studies that showed some evidence to the theoretical model may have overstated the possible effects or reported positive results when the relationships were even null or negative. To better understand the model's validity and its scope of applicability, I reanalyzed and synthesized 10 previously collected affect datasets from diverse learning contexts and relatively more diverse student populations. All but one datasets were collected using human annotation by culturally sensitive, trained, and certified coders who observed students while using a widely used protocol called PROMP to reduce rate of bias and observer effect. I chose to use the redefined L statistic and proposed standardized treatment of edge cases that lacked consensus in the literature. I chose to exclude self-transitions as this would likely reveal a larger number of affective patterns that might otherwise be suppressed by persistent affective states. Lastly, I used Tau4C to summarize significance levels from multiple affect datasets. Summarizing the significant levels across all the datasets reveals that among the 6 transitions hypothesized by the theoretical model, only 1 transition holds true. However, if we restrict the scope of applicability by nationality, affect transitions appear to be a little more stable in the United States, with no transitions being significantly more likely than chance in the Philippines. There are 3 main implications of this study. First, it showed non-conformance of data to the widely accepted theoretical model of student affect. I believe that it is highly unlikely that there is a general multi-step pattern in affect dynamics, while there may still be some contextually relevant patterns useful to understand a student experience in specific student subpopulations. Second, the study also addressed some methodological concerns in affect dynamics analysis that were overlooked in the past studies, especially in using L statistic. Conducting transition analysis with affect data has some continued challenges. For example, certain affective states like frustration tend to have low base rates. Also, due to practical constraints in data collection, field observations tend to produce short affect sequences, and these peculiarities have led to issues with spurious results in using standard methods for transition analysis. So my colleagues and I have been working on innovative ways to mitigating some of these issues, one of which also used epistemic network analysis as a methodology for affect dynamics analysis. There are some more open questions on the implication of sampling rates, grain size, session lengths of affect studies. For example, field observations tend to sample at slower rates. They are also coarser grained as compared to automated detection. And we are yet to look at these methodological choices and the impact they have on the validity and applicability of the theoretical model. More importantly, this study highlighted the need to focus on cultural factors in affect dynamics research. Given the differences in national culture, school culture, use of edtech, and forms of disengagement in the two countries studied, it is difficult at this point to understand why we are seeing these differences. More broadly, however, we know that culture influences emotional expression and regulation, and that it also influences frequency and emergence of affect. Other contextual factors like age also influences emotional expressivity. Hence, a better understanding of the role that context plays in is important for any future attempts to study affect dynamics as a generalizable phenomenon. Finally, like its predecessors, the study conceptualizes affect as experienced by an individual state, a student, and affect dynamics in collaborative settings are yet to be studied. All right. So taking a step back and going back to what I was telling before about upstream sources of bias, through the study that I just presented and the other two studies in my dissertation, I illustrate the existence of potential biases in upstream sources such as theory, design, and data collection method that closely shape adaptive learning systems. I will now quickly summarize my key findings from the other two studies. In my second study, I examined the conditions under which the relationships between students' behavior, motivation, and outcomes vary across different demographic contexts. By doing so, I challenged the implicit assumptions of generalizability in design choices, especially to the student populations that is currently understudied in bias evaluation. This includes students with low socioeconomic status, English as a second language, and special education. I also demonstrated the use of publicly available school-level demographics for bias research, where there is often access to larger and more diverse samples of student data, but individual student demographics may be difficult or impossible to acquire. The results of my last study reveals demographic disparity in the effectiveness of methodological improvement in data collection. In this work, I experimented with active machine learning to improve annotated data collection of affect. This method suffers from the cold start problem, where it does not have access to sufficient data yet to learn from. With Dr. Andrew Lan, I devised an approach to use past affect data to overcome this limitation. Our experiments showed that mismatches in the urbanicity, so suburban, urban versus rural, so urbanicity of the past data or the schools where the data came from, the mismatch in there, which is mixing up urban and suburban schools, for instance, could lead to biased data collection of affect for target students or population. While my dissertation identified upstream sources of biases in adaptive learning systems, I'm also looking at locating the origins of these upstream sources, upstream biases. As highlighted in the study I presented, representation bias can occur for several reasons. Most research tends to be conducted in Western countries with adaptive systems developed by designers in the West. Small-scale experiments also tend to recruit from a convenient sample due to practical constraints of research projects. Even when there is access to larger, more diverse datasets, it is often harder to collect student demographics data due to concerns over student privacy. Such representation bias can invalidate assumptions for students of populations not represented in the experiments informing these upstream components. Similarly, measurement bias can occur due to issues in data collection methods, such as lack of reliability of measurements across different student subpopulations. For example, coder bias due to cross-cultural affect coding and demographic disparities in the reliability of self-reports. And lastly, historical bias due to forming theories and design choices by observing the world as it exists, including its biases. For example, earlier cameras were designed to bring out high contrast and better resolution for white skin color. Lastly, I would like to present some of my future lines of inquiry. Motivated by the inextricable link between learning and context, I embarked on this journey interested in investigating how ignoring learner context in the design and development of adaptive learning systems could introduce harmful biases in them. I have explored a few first steps towards building equitable educational technologies. I have tried to bring attention of bias research to those aspects of the design and development of adaptive systems that are often obscured in the evaluation of bias in an algorithmic model. Specifically, my research so far has identified some of the issues in sources such as theories, design, and data collection methods for demographic categories such as urbanicity, race or ethnicity, economic status, English as a second language, special education, and charter school. Achieving equity in educational technology has a long way to go with several open questions that I intend to answer in my future work. I am focused on these 3 lines of inquiry in the future, and I'm looking forward to your feedback and your questions in any of these as well. I plan to develop theory and methods for understanding, identifying, and mitigating bias in adaptive learning systems. And I'm also trying to focus on conducting empirical work that is focused intentionally on contextualizing the experiences of diverse student subgroups to serve the needs of all students, especially those who are likely to be underserved by a biased system. Towards this, I am thinking of 3 lines of inquiry, so 3 ways of approaching this problem. So the first line of inquiry is focusing on theory building for research design and practice. The often overlapping conceptualizations of bias and the harms they cause have themselves been considered a potential limitation that needs to be addressed as the work to mitigate it emerges. Hence, there is a new urgency to define or to provide definitions and theoretical grounding for the known biases in technology enabling adaptive systems. To respond to this challenge, especially for educational affective computing, I plan to extend my research to develop a theoretical framework for bias representing its sources, origins, impacted populations, and harms. And by narrowing the scope of this research away from the generalities of data and algorithms, I hope to focus on developing sharper distinctions on the categories of bias for affective technologies, while also grounding the categories in authentic educational constructs and theory. I'm also hoping that we could do some auditing of the real world affect data sets and educational technology systems to sort of empirically test and further refine the framework. I'm hoping that this work would lead to providing a nuanced understanding of known biases to find ways to mitigate them and identify gaps for further investigation. I hope that it serves as a shared language for researchers, designers, and practitioners, and also all stakeholders that can be used to audit educational technologies for known biases. The second way in which we could approach this problem is by looking at technical approaches to mitigating bias. Through this line of inquiry, I want to develop a context-aware learning analytics method that considers student diversity by design. There are new approaches being developed for fair machine learning. The general idea is to add fairness as a constraint while optimizing the model, such that the model with the best fairness trade-off is selected. More often than not, the issue of bias or unfairness in this discussion is conceptualized predominantly as a technical problem with little consideration to real-world context. The problem, however, is that there is no consensus on what fair even means. Fair to whom? To answer, we need to take an explicit position on where we as a society stand on the social construct of fairness. Is it the benefit of the majority group, avoiding harm to the marginalized people, making systems fair to all groups, or providing justice to historically disadvantaged groups? We also need to define the groups explicitly, which is also not straightforward. For example, is it a specific race or gender or sexual orientation or a specific combination of those? As I mentioned earlier, one of my findings so far highlights how the group differences that matter most for educational technology design might not be the groups that are the most immediately obvious. By grounding these investigations in an authentic educational construct, we can test the limits of advancements in fair machine learning by juxtaposing it with the complexities in the real world and highlighting the complexities involved in posing educational problems algorithmically. I am going to skip this in the interest of time and quickly jump onto this last line of inquiry, where I'm hoping to explore ways to bring the voices of teachers and learners in designing equitable human AI technology. I believe that it is both an imperative and an opportunity to engage and empower stakeholders to use learning analytics as a tool to drive positive social change. And in one of my previous work, I worked with in-service teachers to co-construct approaches to integrate computational technology into their subject matters, wherein we chose an approach of distributed expertise, wherein the teachers brought expertise of the pedagogical context and content, and I went as an expert of technological knowledge. And I'm hoping to do something similar here to conduct human-centered studies with teachers who use adaptive learning systems in their classroom to sort of like develop research studies that would both elicit fairness understanding from them and to conduct collective audits to identify and detect bias in adaptive learning systems. Well, I guess I am almost out of time and I want to give 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm very curious to hear your feedback. So I'm going to pause here and just say that I believe that the issues of bias is a serious one right now that people who are working on educational technology need to focus on. And I believe that the three aspects that I mentioned as the future lines of inquiry, including theory, technical approaches, and human-centeredness, I believe is going to be important in addressing and even understanding and approaching issues of bias. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamia. That was wonderful. So now is the time when we get to open things up to questions and discussion. So feel free to, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, use the microphone, or use the chat if you'd like to, but let's open things up.
Yes, David.
Well, I'm always happy to jump in. So Shamya, you know that I think this work is really interesting and important, in part because we hired you. So that's a pretty good signal on that. So one of the things that I've been puzzling around, and I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on it. This is a kind of an oversimplified way of describing the problem, but let's say I have two groups, right, in the data, and I have some thing that I'm measuring. It could be the code rates, or it could be a more sophisticated model, right? And whatever the results are differ between the two groups. So similar to the way that and it happened in the Philippines, right? So sometimes that's evidence of bias. Sometimes that could actually be what we would otherwise call a result. And how do you think about disentangling those things, sort of both methodologically and conceptually, as you're thinking about ways of measuring, mitigating, understanding bias? That makes
I
sense of the
see.
question?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So far, I don't think I would consider a measure, like say a measure of, say we are measuring self-efficacy or a certain affective state, or, like I wouldn't say the difference in the measure of the educational construct itself as bias, but rather, and correct me if I've got your question wrong, David, what I would consider as bias, especially in predictive modeling, in automated decision making, is the model's performance in predicting that construct. So if there is a difference in false positives, if there is a difference in prediction accuracy or any other AUC or any other measure that you have for the performance of the model, or for its error differences in error rates and such. So that difference in there is what I would consider as bias. One of the challenges that recently I was looking at a model of MOOC dropout rates. And one of the things that's interesting and that's challenging right now is, what do we call as bias? Is a model difference of say 0.001 AUC bias? How do we set a threshold even for calling something as bias, in the difference in say accuracy or performance, for instance? I think that is the bias that I'm talking about, but please correct me if I got your question wrong.
No, yeah, so you're saying that it's the bias is in the difference in error rates, rather than differences in a statistic overall.
Or
Okay.
it could be something more sophisticated, like if there is difference in false positives for one group, false positive rates for one group than the other, for instance. I think that's where sort of like the conversations, at least in machine learning, was sort of heightened because of the ProPublica case, where there was a difference in the parole, is that the right word? Parole rates, like false positives in higher false positive rates in African American population as compared to Caucasian population, in somebody has being tagged as higher likelihood of recidivism. Yeah.
What other questions do folks have? Otherwise, I have a follow-up to that one as people are thinking, or just something that sparked for me. So if I'm understanding correctly, Shamya, you're saying that like one way of kind of operationalizing or considering bias is looking at differentiation in in error rates that we can kind of have like different metrics of. And I think in a case where if you see differences, say in a model result or a description or a score or something, and you can quantify that in terms of like getting at the error rates, but if you just are otherwise seeing the description or the model result absent that, or maybe setting that aside, if you have differences between these two groups, teasing out, like I liked your description of theory or some of these other upstream things that could lead to descriptions of this, is to say, is what I'm seeing in the model the result of a phenomenon there where these different groups of people actually have differences that we think are the model is useful, to kind of use the language that you use. The model is useful, and I'm actually picking up what I want to, versus no, this is not high fidelity. This is a source of something. It could be downstream or upstream, but what I'm seeing here is an artifact of bias rather than the real thing that I want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So quickly to respond to that, Brendan, that is true. In fact, I guess one of what you mentioned is a possible upstream source of a bias in a predictive model. So if there is fundamental differences in those two groups, but if the model has been designed keeping the majority group in mind, because machine learning models are designed, especially when you're training and optimizing them, you're optimizing for say some performance metrics like say accuracy or AUC or whatever. Of course, a model is going to you're going to pick the model that's going to do well overall, because that leads to overall high accuracy. So fairness was never designed into
it.
Picking. Yes, exactly. So fundamentally, if two groups are different, say the features, there are features that are more predictive for one group than the other, like extracurricular activities as a feature for predicting college success is going to be more accurate for groups that can afford to have extracurricular activities as high schools, versus those that group which probably had to work a job or take care of their family. And so that is not fundamentally predictive. Those features are not predictive for that other group. So to have that as a predictor is then going to lead to possible biases, because fundamentally the features themselves
it's baked into it already.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm remiss as the host, I didn't see if Yeyu's question came into the chat or Carl's came first. So I think it maybe was Carl first. Carl, would you like to
Carl
ask?
first.
Okay, thanks, Yeyu. And then why don't we do Yeyu and then David?
Okay. Very nice presentation, Shamia. Nice to listen to your wonderful research again. So I just want to echo the previous questions. I do, once the data set is there, when the data is collected, I think the best we can do is to measure everything accurately and fairly. We can never measure anything absolutely accurate. There must be error. The only thing we can control is fairly accurate, not just measure this group more accurately, but keep a lot of error in another group. I guess that's the best we can do. So I have a lot of thinking about this kind of things. One thing is, if we, of course, the bias can come at different levels, like in the experimental design, data collection, we forget about that. Just talking about for collected data set, when we measured, when we modeled, so what are the sources of the errors? The thing that I have been thinking about, for example, for text data, the source, one of the sources of bias is the culture. Because, for example, we all use English language, but when we talk about something, people from different culture may use different ways, may use different expressions to talk about things. So that's called a cultural difference. But when we analyze data, if we're unaware of that, we may just pick the culture of the majority, and then, for example, when we code data, annotate data, we may pay more attention to annotate the way the majority talks about things and underrepresent the minority group. I don't know if that is right, or are there other major sources of bias that causes major errors? I just want to hear from you about that.
So your question, Carl, is if we have already collected data, right? If you have already collected data, then if we are at the process in the if we are in the stage at the pipeline where we are building a model, then at that stage, what could we be mindful of? in terms of like looking for possible ways in which our pipeline may be introducing bias, right? So yes, for sure. So annotation, yes. So if I think annotation, I am thinking of annotation as the label or the outcome of predictive model, but also features, right? So when you're designing features, we could look for subgroup differences in the feature itself, differences in correlation between these features and the the outcome variable, like if there is differences in there. I think there are several other ways too, but then I don't think we should stop at thinking that, oh, we have collected the data and then right now we have to work with the data. And, like, I think there is still it's important that we do audits. So say we have built model, it's important that we go back even at any point, even if a model is in production and it's making automated decisions in the systems we have built. I think it is still important that we go back to these models and audit them for the different subgroups that we are interested in. Again, I think a question there would be that how do we know all the different subgroups and all of that? But that's a difficult. It's a very difficult problem that we all need to address in even understanding how do we come up with this list of subgroups. But having an automated decision making algorithm in a system that is not being audited just fundamentally makes me uncomfortable. So that is where I would say that, yeah, so even if you've collected the data, there are several things you could do while you're building the model, but maybe even after a model is built and out in production, the ways in which we can at least audit and be aware of potential ways in which the systems could be biased. So in the future, more data collection can then focus on finding ways in which we can do focused data collection for groups that are possibly underrepresented or unrepresented in our previously collected data set.
So it almost sounds like very targeted types of closing the interpretive loop in QE speak, to say like we're going to check for specific impacts of certain biases, not just general stuff, which I think would be a new articulation or practice if we kind of drew the outlines of that. So Yeyu, you had a number of questions here, so I don't know if we can get through all of them in the remaining time, but I'll turn things over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. Since a lot of questions already touched by folks, I'm going to focus on one question specifically, which is, we are trying to model the reality. We collect data from the reality, and then we try to make a model to make it abstract of the reality. So during this process, I wonder how you could possibly quantify fairness in the model, because I found it's a really untangible thing. It's not like the standard deviation of the correct versus not correct. It's how do you think about that? Like, how do you embed that into your model in terms of whatever, regardless of the machine learning model or QE model? What is the mechanism for that?
Yeah, I just want to understand your question better here. So are you saying that there is difference between the proxies or the measurements of construct versus the true construct? There is a difference. You're saying that there is a delta there, and how do we?
Yeah, as an outsider of machine learning studies, I'm thinking about maybe this could work, is that we not only have a label for, let's say, prediction for going to college versus not going to college, that's the ground truth label, but we probably have another set of the label in terms of fairness, whether that's a fair representation versus not. So if we optimize on both of that, we calculate the loss function on both of that. That could be a way out to operationalize and quantify fairness in model. But I wonder how you guys quantify fairness in the models. And so that could be more aligned with what reality is.
I see. Yeah, actually this sort of I don't know if my answer is I don't think I have one answer for you here, but one thing in which I have been thinking, because this is also specifically important for the kinds of automated decision making that an adaptive learning system does, like it's difficult to specifically say that something is fair versus unfair. Like say if a model is giving a student a question of a particular skill set, if it is below their current skill set, or how do we reason out, like how different is an algorithmic decision making from a human decision making that we hope is unbiased. So maybe there is a way in which we could bring in voices of like teachers maybe here into even understand whether or not what we are considering as these measures and what we are defining as fair or unfair in the educational practice, if that makes sense. That kind of conception makes sense. That's not really a concrete answer for you, Yeyu, but that's where my thinking is right now.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shamia.
Well, and I think a lot of these issues should be part of ongoing discussions, obviously, like which I think you laid out nicely in your future work. We are technically at time, so I'd like to thank everyone for coming and quickly mention we're still finalizing some of the dates and timings, but we do have at least 2, if not 3 more of these webinars coming up. I know one of them for sure is going to be about teaching QE, which will be happening, I believe, in September. And then there's a few others to look out for as well. But please follow up with Shamia. She has been kind enough to drop her email into the chat there. And I'm going to stop the recording now.